King Edward II of England, the early years. Edward II, also referred to as Edward of Carnarvon, was born on April 25, 1284, and ruled as King of England from 1307 until his deposition in January 1327. As the fourth son of Edward I, he only became heir to the throne after the death of his elder brother Alfonso. From 1300 onwards, Edward accompanied his father on military campaigns in Scotland and was knighted in an elaborate ceremony at Westminster Abbey in 1306. He ascended the throne the following year upon his father's death, inheriting a kingdom with unresolved conflicts and financial difficulties. In 1308, he married Isabella, the daughter of King Philip IV of France, in a strategic union designed to solidify relations between the English and French crowns, though tensions between the two nations remained unresolved. Background: Edward II was the fourth son of Edward IV, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and ruler of Gascony in southwestern France, which he held as a vassal of the French king. His mother, Eleanor, Countess of Ponthieu, belonged to the Castilian royal family and provided Edward with a link to continental European nobility. Edward I was a formidable military leader, crushing baronial uprisings in the 1260s and taking part in the Ninth Crusade. During the 1280s, he completed the conquest of North Wales, eliminating the rule of native Welsh princes and reinforcing English control over the region. In the 1290s, he intervened in Scotland's civil war, asserting his claim of overlordship over the country. His rule was widely regarded as effective, as he maintained firm control over the powerful English nobility. Historian Michael Prestwich describes Edward I as a ruler who inspired fear and respect, while John Gillingham refers to him as an efficient bully. Despite his military successes, Edward I left his son a series of significant problems. One of the most pressing was England's ongoing conflict in Scotland, where Edward I's extended campaign had failed to secure full control before his death. His rule over Gascony also provoked friction with the French monarchy, as the French kings insisted that English rulers pay homage for the territory, an expectation that English kings found humiliating. Domestically, Edward I had faced increasing resistance from his barons regarding taxation and military requisitions necessary to fund his wars. By the time of his death, he had left his son with debts amounting to approximately £200,000, placing financial strain on the new king's administration. Edward II was born at Carnarvon Castle in North Wales on April 25, 1284, less than a year after his father had secured control over the region. Consequently, he is sometimes called Edward of Carnarvon. The choice of Carnarvon Castle as his birthplace was likely symbolic, as the location was historically significant to the native Welsh, with ties to Roman imperial history, and was the administrative centre of North Wales under English rule. At the time of Edward's birth, contemporary prophets predicted he would achieve greatness, with some proclaiming that he was a new King Arthur who would lead England to renewed glory. A 16th-century cleric, David Powell, later claimed that Edward was presented to the Welsh as a prince born in Wales who could not speak a word of English, but there is no historical evidence supporting this assertion. Edward's name had distinct English origins, linking him to the Anglo-Saxon Saint Edward the Confessor, which set him apart from his siblings who bore more traditional Norman and Castilian names. His older brothers, John and Henry, died before his birth, and Alfonso passed away in August 1284, leaving Edward as the sole heir to the throne. Although he was generally healthy during childhood, concerns persisted about his survival, given the high infant mortality rate of the time and his family's history of losing heirs. Following his birth, Edward was initially cared for by a wet nurse named Iota, or Mary Maunzel, but after she fell ill, Alice de Laygrave took over as his foster mother. Edward had little direct contact with his biological mother, Eleanor, who spent much of his early years in Gascony with his father. He was assigned a dedicated household under the supervision of a clerk, Giles of Oudenarde, ensuring that he was raised with the proper education and preparation for his future role as king. Edward's early years were marked by political and military instability. While his father worked to expand English dominance in Wales and Scotland, Edward was raised in a royal environment that emphasized the importance of kingship and governance. However, he would later struggle to live up to the expectations set by his father's formidable legacy. As king, Edward II would face intense opposition from his barons, including figures such as Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and the powerful nobles who resented his favoritism towards certain courtiers, such as Piers Gaveston. His reign was fraught with political turmoil, and he ultimately proved unable to maintain the authority and respect that his father had commanded. This led to his forced abdication in January 1327 and his subsequent imprisonment, marking a tragic end to his reign and life. Childhood, personality, and appearance. As Edward matured, the financial resources allocated to his personal household grew significantly, reflecting his increasing status. In 1293, William of Blythburgh was appointed as the administrator of his household, overseeing expenditures and logistics. It is widely believed that Edward received some degree of religious education, facilitated by the Dominican friars who were invited into his household by his mother in 1290. His discipline and training in essential royal skills, such as horseback riding and military tactics, were overseen by Guy Foray, a loyal follower of his grandmother. Foray's role as Edward's Magister suggests he played a crucial part in shaping the young prince's conduct and abilities. However, it remains uncertain how well educated Edward was, as there is little evidence to confirm his proficiency in reading and writing. Despite this ambiguity, his mother placed great emphasis on education for her other children, and Foray himself was considered a well-educated man for his time. Edward likely communicated primarily in Anglo-Norman French, the standard among English nobility, but he may have also possessed some knowledge of English and Latin. Edward's early years followed the typical pattern for a royal child of his era. He exhibited a keen interest in horses and horse breeding, ultimately becoming a skilled rider. His affection extended to animals in general, particularly dogs, with greyhounds being his favored breed. His correspondence reveals a playful and mischievous sense of humor, as he often joked about gifting his friends animals with unappealing traits, such as stubborn horses or lazy hunting dogs incapable of catching prey. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Edward showed little enthusiasm for popular noble pastimes such as hunting and falconry. Instead, he had a deep appreciation for music, particularly Welsh compositions and newly developed instruments, as well as musical organs. Though he refrained from participating in jousting, whether due to a lack of aptitude or concerns for his safety, he was an ardent supporter of the sport, often watching and cheering from the sidelines. Physically, Edward grew into an imposing figure, standing tall and muscular, a feature that made him widely regarded as handsome by contemporary standards. He developed a reputation as a compelling public speaker, capable of delivering persuasive and charismatic addresses. Additionally, he was well known for his generosity toward his household staff, fostering a sense of loyalty and camaraderie among them. One of his more unusual traits, especially for a nobleman, was his enjoyment of physical labor. He took particular pleasure in activities such as rowing, hedging, and ditching, often spending time among lower-class workers. This behavior was unconventional for someone of his status and attracted considerable criticism from some members of the nobility, who viewed it as unbecoming of a royal prince. In 1290, Edward's father, King Edward I, solidified the Treaty of Berghem, which arranged for his 6-year-old son to marry Margaret of Norway. This union was intended to secure a stable future for Scotland, as Margaret held a potential claim to its throne. However, Margaret's untimely death later that year brought an abrupt end to these arrangements, leaving Scotland's succession uncertain. Tragedy continued to impact Edward's life as his mother, Eleanor, passed away shortly after Margaret, followed by his grandmother, Eleanor of Provence. King Edward I was profoundly affected by the death of his wife and organized an elaborate and solemn funeral in her honor. Following his mother's passing, Edward inherited the county of Ponthieu, adding to his growing responsibilities. Subsequent discussions focused on securing a marriage alliance with France, aiming to strengthen diplomatic ties and bring about lasting peace. However, these efforts faltered due to King Philip IV's unwillingness to cede control of strategic fortresses in Gascony. The failure to reach a compromise contributed to the outbreak of the Gascon War in 1294, further escalating tensions between England and France. Amid these conflicts, another marriage prospect emerged, a union with a daughter of Guy, Count of Flanders, who was engaged in rebellion against the French crown. However, this proposal also failed when King Philip IV intervened, ensuring that the prospective bride was sent to Paris, preventing the match from proceeding. As Edward navigated his youth and early adulthood, he continued to develop his own distinct personality, interests, and unconventional behaviors. His relationships with those around him, including courtiers, servants, and lower-class workers, set him apart from his predecessors and peers. His upbringing and unique character traits would later influence his approach to governance, his handling of court politics, and his relationships with influential figures during his reign. While he lacked some of the martial prowess and military discipline of his father, his charisma, generosity, and appreciation for the arts marked him as a different kind of ruler, for better or worse. Early campaigns in Scotland. Between 1297 and 1298, while King Edward I was engaged in a military campaign in Flanders against Philip IV of France, who had seized part of the English-controlled lands in Gascony, Prince Edward was left in England to serve as regent. Although young, this appointment gave Edward an early taste of governance, exposing him to the complexities of royal administration and court politics. Upon the king's return, a peace agreement was reached, leading to Edward I marrying Philip's sister, Margaret. As part of the treaty, Prince Edward was betrothed to Philip's daughter, Isabella, who was only 2 years old at the time. This strategic alliance was intended to end tensions over Gascony, as their future child would inherit claims to both the English and French thrones, potentially fostering lasting peace between the two rival kingdoms. Prince Edward reportedly formed a close relationship with his new stepmother, who later gave birth to 2 sons, Thomas of Brotherton in 1300 and Edmund of Woodstock in 1301. As king, Edward II would later show generosity to his half-brothers, granting them noble titles and financial support. Edward I resumed his military campaigns in Scotland in 1300 and, this time, took Prince Edward with him to gain battlefield experience. The young prince was granted command of the rearguard during the siege of Caerlaverock Castle, a key stronghold. In early 1301, King Edward I officially declared his son the Prince of Wales, bestowing upon him the earldom of Chester and extensive lands in North Wales. This move was intended to consolidate English control over the region and grant Edward some financial autonomy. As part of his new role, Edward travelled to Wales, where he received homage from his Welsh subjects. Shortly thereafter, he rejoined his father in the 1301 Scottish campaign, leading an army of around 300 soldiers northward and capturing Turnberry Castle. His military involvement continued in 1303 when he participated in another Scottish campaign, laying siege to Brechin Castle. During this campaign, Edward personally oversaw the deployment of a siege engine, demonstrating his growing involvement in military strategy. By the following year, Edward was entrusted with diplomatic responsibilities as he engaged in negotiations with Scottish rebels on behalf of his father. However, when diplomatic efforts failed, he joined Edward I in the siege of Stirling Castle, a decisive moment in the Scottish conflict. The experience provided Prince Edward with additional exposure to warfare and leadership, though it is unclear how much tactical command he exercised independently. By 1305, tensions arose between Prince Edward and his father, largely due to disputes over finances. The prince quarrelled with Bishop Walter Langton, the royal treasurer, over the amount of financial support he was receiving. King Edward I sided with Langton, leading to the prince and his close companions being expelled from court and temporarily losing their financial privileges. This period of estrangement did not last long, as family members and advisors intervened, eventually facilitating a reconciliation between father and son. Nonetheless, this episode foreshadowed the financial struggles that would later plague Edward's reign as king. The Scottish conflict reignited in 1306 when Robert the Bruce assassinated his rival, John Comyn III of Badenoch, and declared himself King of Scotland. Edward I, determined to crush Bruce's rebellion, assembled a fresh army and entrusted his son with a prominent role in the campaign. Before departing for battle, Prince Edward was formally made Duke of Aquitaine, a prestigious title solidifying his status within the English nobility. He was also knighted in a grand and elaborate ceremony at Westminster Abbey known as the Feast of the Swans. This event, steeped in the traditions of chivalry, featured a grand feast reminiscent of Arthurian legend and the Crusades. During the ceremony, Edward and a gathering of young knights collectively swore an oath to defeat Bruce and restore English dominance in Scotland. Although Prince Edward held a leadership position in the campaign, the extent of his military contributions remains unclear. Under orders from Edward I, the English forces executed a ruthless campaign against Bruce's supporters in Scotland, implementing harsh retaliatory measures that included executions and the confiscation of lands. Despite these efforts, Bruce managed to evade capture and continued his resistance. Prince Edward returned to England in September, while diplomatic negotiations concerning his arranged marriage to Isabella of France continued. His marriage, intended as a strategic alliance, would later have significant consequences for his reign. Edward's experiences during these campaigns, his role as regent, his battlefield exposure, his diplomatic engagements, and his conflicts with court officials, shaped his early adulthood. Though he gained insight into governance and military strategy, his time under his father's rule was marked by struggles with authority and financial disputes. These experiences foreshadowed the challenges he would face as king, as he attempted to balance the expectations of nobility, military leadership, and diplomacy in a rapidly evolving political landscape. Piers Gaveston and Edward's close relationships. The relationship with Piers Gaveston. During Edward's early years, he developed an exceptionally close relationship with Piers Gaveston, the son of a household knight whose family held lands near Gascony. Gaveston entered Prince Edward's household in 1300, potentially at the behest of Edward I. Their bond quickly deepened, and Gaveston rose in status, first becoming a squire and later one of Edward's most trusted and favoured companions. By 1306, during the Grand Feast of the Swans, Gaveston was knighted by the king, marking his elevation in the royal circle. However, in 1307, Edward I abruptly exiled Gaveston to Gascony. The reason for this decision remains unclear, but one chronicler claims that Edward I flew into a rage when his son requested to grant Gaveston the county of Ponthieu, allegedly responding by violently yanking Edward's hair before ordering Gaveston's banishment. Official court records, however, suggest that this exile was temporary and well-funded, implying that it may have been more of a disciplinary measure than a complete severance. Gaveston's influence over Edward did not wane during his exile, and his return to England upon Edward I's death led to his rapid rise in power and wealth. Edward II, upon ascending the throne, granted Gaveston the title of Earl of Cornwall, a move that incited resentment among the English nobility. The nobility viewed Gaveston's elevation as inappropriate, seeing him as a foreign upstart unworthy of such prestige. Gaveston's arrogance and ostentatious displays of wealth only fueled their hostility, as he openly flaunted his favoured status, mocking senior nobles and asserting his influence at court. Speculations on Edward's sexuality. The precise nature of Edward's relationship with Gaveston has been the subject of considerable speculation among historians. Due to the scarcity of concrete evidence, it is challenging to determine whether their bond was purely one of intense friendship and political alliance or whether it extended to a romantic or sexual relationship. In medieval England, the Church strongly condemned homosexuality, equating it with heresy, making any potential romantic relationships between men a highly sensitive and dangerous subject. Both Edward and Gaveston were married and had children. Edward himself fathered an illegitimate son and was even rumoured to have been involved in a romantic affair with his niece, Eleanor de Clare. Despite the lack of definitive proof, contemporary sources provide some clues. An anonymous chronicler in the 1320s described how Edward felt such love for Gaveston that he bound himself to him before all other mortals with a bond of indissoluble love. This wording suggests an extraordinary emotional connection, although it does not confirm a physical relationship. The first explicit accusation that Edward engaged in same-sex relations did not appear until 1334, when Bishop Adam Allerton was accused of having described Edward as a sodomite in 1326. Allerton later defended himself, claiming he had actually been referring to Edward's advisor, Hugh Despenser the Younger, rather than the king himself. A chronicle from the 1390s, known as the Moe Chronicle, simply alleged that Edward indulged too much in the vice of sodomy, though without further context or corroboration. The question of Edward's sexuality is further complicated by the broader political landscape of the time. Accusations of sodomy were often wielded as political weapons against powerful figures, as seen in similar charges levied against Pope Boniface VIII and the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Many historians believe that the allegations against Edward were at least partly politically motivated, intended to undermine his authority and justify opposition to his rule. Alternative interpretations and historical perspectives. Some historians argue that Edward and Gaveston's relationship was nothing more than an intense friendship and a mutually beneficial political partnership. The ambiguous language used by chroniclers, combined with the political motivations behind many of the accusations, leaves room for doubt regarding the romantic nature of their connection. Given that chroniclers of the time often wrote with an agenda, it is possible that later accounts of Edward's alleged relationships were influenced by his eventual downfall and the hostility he faced from the nobility. Historians such as Michael Prestwich and Seymour Phillips have pointed out that the English royal court was an exceptionally public institution, making it unlikely that a same-sex affair involving the king could have remained discreet. Additionally, neither the contemporary church, Edward I, nor Edward's father-in-law, Philip IV of France, appear to have expressed any direct concerns about his personal conduct in this regard. If Edward's behavior had been perceived as scandalous or unacceptable at the time, it is likely that his contemporaries would have commented on it more explicitly. A more recent theory, proposed by historian Pierre Chaplet, suggests that Edward's close bond with Gaveston was not a matter of romance, but rather a profound, knightly friendship based on loyalty, camaraderie, and shared military experiences. In medieval society, strong emotional attachments between men, particularly those forged through knighthood and shared hardships, were common and often idealized. It is possible that Edward and Gaveston's relationship followed this pattern rather than being of a romantic nature. Despite the ongoing historical debate, what is clear is that Gaveston's prominence in Edward's life played a crucial role in shaping the early years of his reign. His influence over the king, combined with his provocative behavior toward the nobility, ultimately contributed to his downfall. Whether Edward's attachment to Gaveston was driven by deep friendship, political reliance, or something more remains an enduring mystery, continuing to intrigue scholars and historians alike. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.